So I had another dream, which inspired this video. We don't often speak about these kinds of experiences, not because they don't happen, but because they're hard to language. And I've always had somewhat of a challenged relationship with language and words, and I often find myself disagreeing with different dictionary definitions, because how to describe something that didn't happen in words or pictures but was very real and did translate into or was accompanied by a very distinct and unique sensation in the body. So that's what this talk is about. Those things that we see but not with our eyes, we hear but not with our ears, are felt but from a location seemingly outside of, though connected with or to, the body. So I was up at 4 a.m. I did my usual morning stuff. I fed the cats, I let them out, I made coffee, I journaled, and I sat with myself for a while. And sometime around 7:30, I felt something pulling me inward in a very particular way. So I knew I had to lie back down. And once I was lying down, I left the waking state pretty quickly. And then I could hear a voice, as if in a dream, but also I definitely was not dreaming, right? Because I had a sense of my own body, like I was between sleeping and waking, between dreaming consciousness and waking consciousness, that kind of hovering space in between. And I heard it like it was the tail end of a conversation. And then we can talk about one of my favorite subjects, the non-perceptual. And my mind was aware that it just heard that and that it had a different quality to it. And I thought, oh, okay. And then there was like this vapor-like felt sense of a presence leaving my body field. And it played out a few times, like it either needed to leave in layers or it wanted me to take note of it, because it became very obvious to me with some kind of a suction feeling, like it was being drawn out of me. Yeah, it was definitely a feeling of a presence departing. Isn't this an interesting feeling, right? And as it disappeared, I heard myself say, "Thank you," as my mind began to immediately ponder, well, what is the non-perceptual, right? Beyond perception, outside of perception. Well, is there really such a thing? Now, I really don't like this term non-perceptual, because is there really such a thing as non-perception? If we're perceiving it, then it's a perception. So let's look at the definition of perception: the ability to see, hear, or become aware of something through the senses, right? And immediately I'm like, well, that's not perception. I don't agree with this definition at all, because what they are referring to is really just sense perception. So let's call it what it is, right? And furthermore, I recently came across some information that said, well, we don't just have 5 senses, we actually have 15. Really? Only 15? I mean, who is mapping this, and can it even be defined? I don't know. Anyway, it said that these additional 5 senses are comprised of the parts of reality and of ourselves that speak in internal and external spatial relationships, right? Balance, and this other thing, this intelligent resonance, rather than its sensorial qualities of information, which are highly languaged, right? We have a lot of words to describe the 5 sensory experience, but there's this whole other experience and sensing that reaches us not through our eyes or ears, but through our openness to perceive, both through and beyond our inner biofield, right? There are realms of communication that don't require sound. Transmissions that bypass the senses entirely and move straight into, well, is it in? Is it contained within? Or is it out here somewhere? Where's the locus of our awareness? Where is our perception originating? And I'm not just talking about sense perception, though, through the body, but I am also talking about that. I often talk about stepping back from the body into or through where our awareness and larger or greater consciousness perceives itself and reality through our own unique body center. And everyone has their own body-centered perception, and there are these spaces in between which are essential for the perceptual mechanism to function, to receive information through, right? So now hold that thought for a minute, because we're going to intentionally limit ourselves back to a definition so that we can start to expand back out again, right? So what is the perception of and through this space between? To understand what we mean by non-perceptual, we first have to understand perception itself, right? What is it? What it is most commonly considered to be is perception in the conventional sense. It refers to and through the five senses, right? The definition is very body-centered. Yet perception can also be more of a mental construct, right? A concept or interpretation of something, an event, a person, or an experience, like a perspective. But these five sensorial channels make up what we call sense perception. It's how we receive and interpret the world around us. The brain receives input from the sensory organs of the body and forms an internal particular interpretation of and experience of sensing through the body, which exists in reality, right? But that picture is variable and unique and also extremely limited. We only see a tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum with our eyes, right? We hear only a very narrow band of vibrational frequencies. We are quite literally tuned into only a tiny fraction of what exists in reality, real reality, right? We have agreed to come into these physical bodies and have this limited sense perception experience that is very convincing, and we've become somewhat entranced by it, right? Yet so much of what we are experiencing here is actually drawing information from a much larger field or extra meta sensory perception. So non-perceptual reality, on the other hand, we're going to say refers to the realms, transmissions, and phenomenon that exist outside of these sensory channels, but can still be known, felt, or experienced not through the eyes or ears, but through the different awarenesses of the body, but beyond the body, beyond the mechanism of the brain, of the mind, yet also beyond the mind. Things like direct knowing, inner resonance, intuition, subtle sensing, field awareness. Many of these involve the inner sensing or mentalism, which corresponds with the outer five senses. It's the experience of receiving information, insight, or contact without it coming through sight, sound, or physical stimulus. This could look like knowing something without knowing how you know it, right? Feeling a presence in the room when no one is there. Hearing your mind respond to something you didn't hear with your ears, like from that dream. Receiving an answer in meditation before you ask the question. This is where we cross into what some traditions call extrasensory perception, or ESP, which has taken on a kind of woo-woo stereotype in many circles, which could very well be just another of the many ways that we've been influenced to disregard or doubt these other higher level perceptions or intelligences, and like dumb ourselves down and limit ourselves. So anyway, let's put that to the side for now and dig into this a little bit. Common names for information perceived without the use of the five senses include the clairs, right? Clairvoyance, clairsentience, claircognizance, clairaudience, intuition. But also beneath them is a more essential capacity, right? The ability to know without seeing, to feel without touching, to hear without sound. These are all seeing, hearing, feeling, but let's talk about this other thing that is called knowing, right? Defined as showing or suggesting that one has knowledge or awareness that is secret or known only to a few people, to be aware of through observation, right? Inquiry or information, to have knowledge or information concerning a thing, to be absolutely certain or sure about something, right? To have knowledge, to recognize, which implies a generative process. First you cognize, and then you reorganize that cognition, recognizing it into a different, higher, or more appropriate or true form. Or maybe not. I mean, you can certainly recognize something into a more limited or disparate form, right? But we're talking about something even more foundational here, right? capacity within every human being to perceive reality beyond the physical senses, not as a supernatural gift that only a few possess or have access to, but as an innate part of our embodied consciousness, cognitive being, and awareness. It's the space where Matrika Shakti begins to stir, this part of us that wants to word things. But what are words really? What was life like before we had language? Thoughts, vibrations, and energies exist in the field before they become sound, image, or forms like words, right? And words are very interesting. Some traditions refer to this pre-language field as the subtle stirrings of consciousness itself, the pulse behind thought, the hum behind sound. That's a deeper conversation for another time, I suppose. Anyway, this is the true non-perceptual realm. Now, I might have this all wrong, but I'm thinking that non-perceptual is not the right way to refer to it. I think it's meta-perceptual or intra-perceptual, hyper-extra-perceptual, intrasensory, right? Help me out here. I mean, what do you think we should call this? Is there a word for it already that I haven't encountered yet? Because dictionary definitions of perceptual, non-perceptual, it just doesn't cut it for me when we're talking about these kinds of things. Because it is very much perceived and or sensed and therefore perceptual. It isn't a non-thing, and it is available to everyone if we learn to sense and listen differently, right? If the non-perceptual realm is this space where communication and knowing happen without physical senses, then we can think of it as a domain of pure vibration and subtle resonance. It's not empty, right? It is alive with activity. But that activity exists beneath or before or around the threshold of what we normally operate through or consider to be conventional limited sense perception and conscious awareness, right? So what is non-perceptual awareness then, right? It is a form of conscious receptivity, right? It doesn't rely on stimulus from the external world. It doesn't require images or words or linear or logical traditional logic, right? It arrives as a felt sense, an inner movement. It has an airy quality, hence involving the vital airs of the body, the pranas. And even, well, I have a different sense of what the pranas are and how they move and vitalize the body and mind. I actually refer to them as humors, right? Not in the way that the ancient Greeks used the word humor, but more as pranas or airs. And well, for me, they're centered around the organs and joints and also engaged with the energetic sheaths of the body, you know, how they breathe and move and exchange between themselves, right? They can also be called subtle, palpable, energetic, breath-like expressions. Right? This kind of awareness is present in deep meditation and active during dreams and altered states. It's alive and highly charged in the imagination and accessible in moments of silence and surrender or intense presence, like in flow states, sometimes mostly when the mind is not doing but simply being. We may not hear anything, but we know we received something, right? It arises from the silence, and then our mind tries to describe it and assign words to it immediately, right? The mind is always swooping in to do that. We may not see an image, but we feel or have a sense that we've been shown something. And then the mind begins to try and create or fill in the image, right? This is the formative, defining power of what we call Matrika Shakti, right? This originary creative impulse behind all thoughts and speech, where images and words are interconnected and intertwined with each other and constantly informing each other, right? In the perceptual realm, we hear a word and then we interpret its meaning. In the non-perceptual realm, we receive the vibration or essence before the mind has a chance to try and form the words, right? It's the murmur behind the thought, the pulse behind the sound, the silence that gives way to a stirring just before awareness names what it felt. So how does this creative energy move into and through non-perceptual awareness? When you suddenly feel a truth or understanding but don't have the words yet, right? When a phrase arises from nowhere and it seems strangely whole and complete before your mind starts to grasp it, to recall it, or orient it within the contextual field of your lived experience, right? Your mind is constantly making associations. And your mind responds to something that you didn't hear, but something was transmitted. Like I heard it partially, it doesn't really make sense, but your mind immediately moves to complete it and contextualize it. So then we're talking about a subtle pre-existing intelligence that permeates the field, giving shape to a mysterious kind of perceptive experience before the mind gets involved, right? In deep meditation, especially in states like the fourth state or the true Riya state, this creative impulse may arise not as a thought, but as an almost potential sound. Something's being stirred or drawn to organize and build and grow or coalesce into verbal form, but it hasn't yet. So there's this kind of stirring in the field, like having the words on the tip of your tongue, right? But you just can't get it out. It's not spoken yet. So what we come to understand is that not all communication is verbal or visual. That intuition and inner knowing are both pre-structured and structured energies that are far from random. We're always in a relationship with vibrational information, whether or not we can name it or understand it. And to attune to the non-perceptual is not to generate meaning with the mind, but to receive the signal before the mind gets hold of it and it becomes limited and somewhat mangled by our incomplete and short-sighted attempts to apply words to it, right? So this non-perceptual awareness is always already happening quietly beneath the surface noise of our daily life and our attention to surface matters. And the more we honor that field beneath and beyond, and the more clearly it begins to speak without words or meaning or alteration. So we don't access it by pursuing it, right? We instead let go of the seeking and the pushing out of our energy to grasp and attain, right? We're always pushing forward, trying to get something. We're attuning our attention instead to the initial arising. We're resting back, slowing down, quieting down our usual channels of awareness. We start slowing down the nervous system, either shutting our eyes if you need to, or just softening your attention on the external scene, right? Softening the senses without shutting them down. Expanding your attention beyond the senses of form into the sensing of a greater field from which form arises. The non-perceptual often comes into view through peripheral awareness, right? Not by focusing harder, but by relaxing and opening up more deeply. And we're not listening for a voice, you're tuning into the space where a voice might emerge. And this is the space between that we get used to dwelling in meditation, when we focus on the space between the breaths and the space between the mantra repetitions, or the space between thoughts, the space between the words. This is where perceptual and non-perceptual awareness begin to meet. You may experience it as a shift in the energy or movement of the airs in your body, like a shift in balance or orientation, like, whoa, something just happened, which is quite subtle, but also very obvious. Or maybe a shift in your mental space or your understanding without any image or thought, like, oh, I just understood something, but I can't quite recall or put a finger on it specifically or capture it in words, right? In your waking state, when you're moving through the world and through interactions, during conversations, you might sense what's not being said, right? A tone, body language, a felt shift or energy shift in another person, a resonant truth, though unspoken. While walking or resting, you may receive a full insight, not as words, but as a complete knowing, which may arise as something completely new or different, or like as a reconfiguration of previous experiences, right? Understandings or realizations, everything's coming together, right? In a new form. Like, yes, that's right. Now it all makes sense. Like, it all is coming together for me now, right? Rather than discard these moments because they aren't verifiable, we can start to recognize them as part of your perceptual field, an extension of your sensing capacity. Perhaps yet not necessarily an end, but most frequently a next level awareness, right? We're constantly spiraling up and opening to an even deeper and higher next level understanding and sense of embodiment, right? We're expanding our physical perception and acknowledging and taking more seriously the appending awareness of this greater field. We're constantly adding on to it while also becoming more simple, intermingling, expanding, contracting, and integrating. Because the goal is integration, right? To live in a world where silence speaks, where the 99.999% of empty space is actually very, very full and always talking to us, where the sensing nature of the body mechanism, the technology of the body system, the structure, becomes the bridge between the visible and the invisible, the known and the unknown, the perceptual and the non-perceptual, although I still don't like that word. The most beautiful and essential aspect in question is one that marks the true maturity of this work, is being able to distinguish between distortion or direct knowing, and discerning between truth and conditioning. And as we deepen into subtle awareness through continued discipline and deeply engaging with the practice, this real challenge arises, right? How do we know whether what we're perceiving is true non-perceptual guidance or just an echo of our old conditioning and karmic patterns or unexamined assumptions, right? This is where getting to know yourself and your own mind and honing your discernment becomes critical, right? The non-perceptual field is very subtle, but so are our mental filters. The scriptures say the veils of the mind are many and varied, because old beliefs and painful experiences can shape how we interpret energy. Trauma and fear can mimic gut feelings, but actually signal hypervigilance. Karma and unresolved emotional loops can project stories onto other people, places, and even our inner signals. So what are some of the signs that you might be projecting conditioning rather than receiving the truth? The insight feels emotionally charged, right? It comes with urgency or fear or defensiveness. It confirms a limiting belief or a painful story you've held for a long time. See, I am unwanted. See, now they don't love me. No one cares. It'll never work. Here we go again, right? It creates contraction or fragmentation and not expansion. Maybe it repeats a familiar drama or reinforces some identity-based wounding, right? These are often signs that you're perceiving through a tinted karmic lens, right? Not from clear field awareness. And what are the signs of genuine non-perceptual knowing? Well, these things, they usually arrive neutrally, often very quietly without drama or emotional spike. They create a sense of peace and clarity or subtle expansion, even if the content is difficult. It doesn't flatter the ego or confirm a known fear. It feels complete or true in its original form, even though it might be fragmented. It doesn't need validation or elaboration. True non-perceptual knowing doesn't argue for your attention or acknowledgement, right? It simply is. And it's fairly easy to both hear and disregard or overlook. So how do we cultivate discernment? Pause before reacting, give space to what's arising, feeling your body. Is there tightness? Is there fear? Is there grasping or openness and stillness? Ask yourself internally, is this coming from truth or from a wound? Does this make me more free or more entangled? So much of what we call reality is shaped by what we can measure, name, or prove, right? We are always looking for this external validation and the science behind things, right? But some of the most profound truths often come not with sound or numbers or agreement, but with stillness and a felt sense resonance. You've already experienced it probably many, many times over, right? That knowing without words, that moment when something moved in you and you couldn't explain why, but some part of you took note. This is what is referred to as the non-perceptual realm, the increasingly more subtle layers of your own awareness, usually or initially without words, right? The silence and the slight that can be found between the sounds and the spaces which become wider and more prominent between the words. The scriptures say that the subtle realm is more real than physical reality. The unseen is not invisible. The imaginary is not unreal. The unheard is not unspoken or silent. And what you can't explain may be the most true thing. The subtle realm is more real than the physical realm, because without the subtle realm, the physical reality would have no ground. So let your listening deepen. Open up to the space between listening and what is being heard, between seeing and what is being seen. Give your perception that space. Allow it to soften and ripen in its receiving ability. Let the field reveal itself to you with care and gentleness and that ancient primordial originary familiarity and camaraderie, right? Because it is quite delightful when you open up and receive and connect with this realer reality that you have always known and been familiar with, right? Thank you for joining me today. Until next time.